Rob was part of each audition, and he was living with her and soon to marry her, and he would obviously do better with her, wanting her to get the job. I mean, was I really the funniest one in the room when we were doing the improvs for all the suits?
After the deaths of Rob Reiner and his wife, Hollywood responded the way it often does when grief intersects with reputation, filling the space with tributes, condolences, and carefully managed silence, while court proceedings and official statements searched for answers without pressing into the questions that felt too uncomfortable to ask. Yet according to Sally Strs, one person already understood what lay beneath the surface, because she had been listening long before the public was invited to mourn, and when rumors began spreading online, she stepped forward not to provoke attention but to shut down speculation that felt safer than truth, revealing a story that was not sudden, not mysterious, and far more disturbing than anyone wanted to admit, especially because parts of it echoed concerns another person close to Rob had quietly raised before the final night. Sally never intended to speak publicly, and those close to her later said she resisted the idea for months, fully aware of what happens when someone challenges a narrative Hollywood has already accepted. But when she eventually appeared, she arrived without a publicist, without a prepared statement, and without protection. And when a reporter casually asked how she was coping, the question landed differently than expected, because Sally froze before whispering, "You don't know what he was living through." And when she followed that with, "We failed him," the meaning was unmistakable, reframing the deaths not as an unpredictable tragedy, but as the end of something visible that had gone unaddressed for far too long. Sally described her relationship with Rob as one that spanned more than 50 years, sustained through professional collaboration and private loyalty, and in the later decades of his life, they spoke several times a week, sometimes late into the night, conversations that moved beyond work and into fears he rarely voiced elsewhere. And it was during his final months, she said, that something shifted, because Rob began calling her after midnight only to hang up seconds later, leaving no explanation. And when she finally confronted him, asking why he kept calling without speaking, he snapped that he couldn't talk long and that someone was listening, before abruptly ending the call, a sentence Sally later said changed everything she thought she understood. 3 weeks before his death, Sally met Rob for lunch in Santa Monica, and she recalled details that stayed with her because they felt wrong, such as his arriving early, choosing a corner table, and refusing to sit with his back to the room. And when his phone buzzed, she said he flinched so violently that he knocked over his water glass, prompting her to joke nervously about who had him so scared. To which Rob leaned in and replied that if he said it out loud, it would become real before, asking her to promise that if something happened, she would tell the truth, a promise she later admitted was the reason she eventually broke her silence. According to Sally, the transformation extended beyond Rob's behavior and into the house itself, which she said shifted from a place once known for loud dinners, political debates, and open doors into an environment governed by control and anticipation, as Rob began insisting on advance notice for visitors, even longtime friends, explaining that he needed to know who was coming and needed time. Language Sally recalled sounding less like hospitality and more like preparation, and inside the home, she described blinds kept drawn even at noon, and when she once reached to open one, Rob grabbed her wrist and whispered for her not to, a moment that left her unsettled long after she left. Sally recalled that Michelle Reiner also seemed changed, keeping her voice low as if the walls themselves could hear, and during one visit, Sally overheard raised voices upstairs, including Nick shouting accusations about money and control, claiming his parents were cutting him off, while Rob pleaded with him to lower his voice, only for Nick to fire back, asking whether Rob would call the police on his own son, a question that reportedly ended the conversation and lingered in the silence that followed. The physical signs, Sally said, became harder to ignore as Rob appeared at a charity meeting wearing long sleeves in August, brushing off comments about the heat by citing doctor's orders, and days later, she noticed bruises near his wristwatch, injuries he dismissed too quickly by blaming stairs and clumsiness, though she recalled his hands shaking as he spoke, and Michelle later admitted she had begun locking her bedroom door at night, quietly saying she hated the sound of footsteps in the hallway, a confession that transformed what once symbolized success into confinement. What once represented safety no longer kept danger out, Sally said, but instead sealed fear inside. And it was during this period that another figure entered the story in a way that changed its scale, when Tom Cruise reportedly visited the Reiner home under the pretext of discussing a future project, only to encounter raised voices, visible distress, and Nick demanding access to money that had been restricted. And when tensions escalated, Cruise allegedly stepped between them, later describing Nick's demeanor to a close associate as empty, detached, and without hesitation. That same afternoon, Sally said Cruz pulled Rob aside into the backyard, away from the house, and warned him plainly that the situation was no longer manageable and that he was in danger, urging him to create distance immediately if possible. But Rob reportedly shook his head, visibly torn, saying his son was sick and that turning his back now would mean losing him forever. A response Sally later said revealed how deeply Rob believed love could still reach where fear already ruled. According to Sally, Cruz went further, offering to pay for an elite rehabilitation facility overseas, fully secured and supervised, insisting he would handle everything if Rob agreed, but Rob declined, explaining quietly that forcing the issue would cost him his son's forgiveness. The sentence Sally said broke her heart because it showed how deeply Rob believed patience could still succeed, and in the weeks that followed, Cruz reportedly stayed in contact, urging Rob to reconsider through increasingly urgent messages, while Rob's replies grew shorter, calmer, and more hopeful than realistic. On the final night, Sally said the same pattern held, as Rob did not contact police or emergency services but instead reached out to a private security firm, reportedly downplaying the severity of the situation and never stating that he was afraid or that lives were at risk, a choice Sally believed sealed the outcome because it reflected his ongoing effort to protect his son from consequences, even as danger escalated beyond control. After learning of the deaths, Cruz reportedly withdrew into silence, later telling friends that he had warned Rob and that Rob chose love, a sentence that now stands as a marker of the moment when everything could have changed and didn't. Yet Sally insisted the story did not end there, because the final truth she revealed extended far beyond one family and into the structures that allowed the situation to remain unnamed. Sally said the danger was not hidden because no one saw it, but because too many people chose not to name it. As agents noticed sudden cancellations, lawyers were aware of unusual financial movements, and doctors treated injuries without asking how they happened, each silence stacking onto the next until the situation became untouchable. And when a longtime industry executive urged her to stay quiet to protect Rob's image, she replied that he was being destroyed while others protected a narrative. Another friend suggested framing the story as family tragedy rather than violence, a suggestion Sally rejected outright, saying tragedy does not leave fingerprints, but violence does, and investigators later reportedly identified patterns that supported her insistence, including repeated emergency room visits labeled as accidents, financial records showing sudden payments to intermediaries, and messages pleading for patience rather than intervention. Sally disclosed that Rob once confided in her after a legal consultation, saying he was advised to document everything, but that he didn't want a case, he wanted his son back, a decision that closed doors that might have saved his life. And Michelle Reiner's role, Sally said, was not passive but exhausted, as she had asked a therapist whether parents could be legally protected from their own adult children, only to be met with procedural delays that arrived too late. The most disturbing realization came after investigators reconstructed a timeline, revealing a familiar cycle of apology, reassurance, pressure, and escalation, suggesting deliberate timing rather than impulsive rage. And Sally rejected attempts to soften the language, insisting that if Rob were a woman, there would be no hesitation in calling it domestic violence, a truth that forced an uncomfortable reckoning about power, gender, and silence. By speaking, Sally did not rewrite Rob Reiner's legacy but clarified it, framing his final act not as weakness but as love pushed beyond reason, because in the end, he wasn't thinking like a director or public figure, but like a father who believed patience could still win, a belief that cost him everything. And while Hollywood may struggle with that reality, Sally made it impossible to ignore. Rob Reiner did not die as a symbol or a headline, but as a human being caught between love and danger. And as the investigation continues, one question lingers in the shadows. How many warnings does love ignore before it becomes fatal? And how many silences are still being mistaken for loyalty?